So hello everyone from the Kingdom of Thailand. Now I must say, I didn't actually think I would do this video because if you guys missed it, last week I did two videos, one about the greatest supposed conservative video games of all time, and then we actually did another one about the greatest supposed conservative movies of all time. Now, these were both based on a Conservapedia list, and you guys can go check out those lists for yourselves. And if you're wondering what Conservapedia is, it's basically a conservative clone of Wikipedia, which was created because they felt like Wikipedia was too biased against conservatives, was too against religion and stuff like that. And if you go look at it, it's just basically like a parallel universe, so it's pretty funny. Now, because someone suggested it in the comments, we have to complete the trilogy. I have to talk about TV shows now. So I was looking at this list and I was thinking this isn't as bad as the other two. I can see a lot of TV shows where I know the TV show is either conservative or can be read in a conservative way. But then there are some pretty funny examples on there too, so I thought we'd talk about it. So you have stuff like Breaking Bad, The Sopranos, The Simpsons, and you guys might think, some of these shows don't have explicit political leanings, but in my mind, to suggest they are conservative is pretty ridiculous. So we're going to dissect that all today. I'm going to talk about some of the shows on there which, are conservative, and that's fair enough. And I feel like unlike movies, where a lot of the best ones are left-wing or anti-status quo, I feel like with TV shows, you do get a lot more conservative shows in general. So I think that's why this list isn't as crazy as the movie one, or especially the video game one, putting stuff like Metal Gear Solid or Red Dead Redemption 2 on there. So all of that coming up for you today. So before we go any further, I want to give a massive shout out to the sponsor of this video, Blinkist. So Blinkist is an app that allows you to understand the most important things from over 5,500 non-fiction books and podcasts in just 15 minutes. So how Blinkist actually works is that you can choose between a transcription or you can actually listen to a host break down the main concepts and messages of a book. These are segmented into various sections known as blinks. So thankfully, Blinkist has lots of curated playlists and actually has topics you can click on to find relevant books. And one of my goals for this year is to brush up more on my economics. With Blinkist, I can absorb the work of people who I have read and studied before, like Adam Smith, or I can also take in the work of people like Milton Friedman, just to give me an insight into the governing ideology of our world. Also, it has more new releases as well, and I made a whole video on Prince Harry's Spare. And thanks to Blinkist, I learned things like Prince Charles might have actually approved bad stories in the press about Harry, so they would actually promote Charles more. That's something I didn't know. And of course, you have the classics like the Communist Manifesto.
Why is it that we never see poor people in Congress or wealthy landowners sweating in factories?
And it was good to listen to someone dive in and explain the themes of Karl Marx's work just to get a good refresher. It also has a really useful feature called Blinkist Connect, and it allows every Blinkist premium plan to be shared by 2 different accounts with no additional cost. And this enables you to invite a second account to join your plan. If they accept the invitation, the owner of the second account will get complete premium access to Blinkist. And all you have to do is tap on the connect icon on the bottom right corner of the screen on the app and tap on share your free invite. And even though you're sharing the plan, you will keep 2 separate accounts and you only share what you want to share. And this easily allows you to recommend titles and share your favorites to each other. So get 25% off Blinkist Premium and enjoy 2 memberships for the price of 1, and start your 7-day free trial by clicking on the link in my pinned comment, and also it's in the description too. So now let's go on to the Conservapedia list. I am a bit sad there aren't any massive examples of shows I really care about that are left wing that pop up, but there are some you guys will all know. Now, if you just go onto the front page, you of course see some stuff like 24, which is really not surprising. That would be on a conservative shows list. But honestly, this list just starts off weird. You have American Idol 2002 to 2016. The reality talent show shows the best amateur singers of the public to come to the 4 Musically, with the winner at the end of each season earning a record deal. This reflects the core of the American dream. Anyone, regardless of his or her origins, can succeed and move upwards in society. I mean, we can have a conversation about like reality TV, game shows, and talent shows, and how they do exploit people's like material needs and stuff. I've actually kind of talked about this before in regards to like Mr. Beast videos. I really do not read American Idol or The X Factor in like a very, very conservative light. It feels to be fairly apolitical, and if we delve into like the background of talent shows, maybe a bit like capitalistic. And then you do have shows like this, I'm not going to argue this one, The Apprentice. Now The Apprentice is hosted by billionaire Alan Sugar in the UK, hosted by Donald Trump, of course, in the US. So in this reality competition, contestants compete for a prestigious position in one of the divisions of Donald Trump's business empire. Liberals stopped watching when they realized that Trump, who is apparently a liberal for much of the 2000s, was turning conservative. I mean, yeah, like a reality show where you have to win to then go work for like a conservative con artist like Donald Trump. I mean, it doesn't get more conservative than that. I guess a lot of people did like it. Like a lot of people like The Apprentice in the UK. I actually used to watch it as well, and you do kind of like it for like the drama and how brutal Alan Sugar could be. But as you get older, it just gets kind of ruined because you get so disillusioned with like entrepreneurial capitalism. And Alan Sugar and Donald Trump are both terrible people, and Donald Trump has been a terrible person for a long, long time. So I can understand why people in the liberal sphere didn't like it. And of course, with Alan Sugar, I can understand why liberal people or leftist people don't like the UK version of The Apprentice. But so far, so good. If you think these shows are great, that's your opinion, and they are pretty much conservative. I got no problem with that. Of course, like the movie one, you do have weird things like Band of Brothers, which says it's promoting the military and American values in a positive light, as well as the Germans in a negative light. I mean, is that the bare minimum? And is that conservative? The thing with war movies, especially set in the past, you can often read them as like a bit more like conservative or just more like politically neutral because they're telling historical events. We'll say that if conservatives made everything like they did back in the past with like the old war movies, I don't think you'd get things like Band of Brothers as much, although I will say I can understand why conservatives read this show as more conservative than something like The Pacific, which we're going to talk about a bit later, but again, not so bad. And then of course you have stuff like Chernobyl, which they probably absolutely love because they feel like the whole series is just a complete indictment of communism as an ideology. I haven't actually seen that. But then they can have stuff like The Cosby Show, which is there as well, or Dog the Bounty Hunter. They can have that as well. I'm not going to argue with you that Dog the Bounty Hunter, about bounty hunters going around with paintball guns and then dogs starting to talk about Christianity all the time, is like a left-wing show, so you can have that one as well, conservatives. So far, not as bad as the other list, but now we're getting into pretty bizarre territory. So the first one I really want to talk about is Netflix's House of Cards. Now, this is a show I actually really like, and it was a big deal when it came out, and I think, you know, until like season 5, the show is really good. Of course, Kevin Spacey rightly fired in disgrace from the show, but season 6 was a complete mess. One of the worst series of TV I've ever watched in my life. But generally, seasons 1 to 2, absolutely amazing television. If you've never watched it because it's been kind of like memory hold on Netflix because of Kevin Spacey, I would actually recommend watching it. I think it's very good. I think all the cast do a really good job. I wouldn't say it's a pro-conservative show, though. And I can understand the justification this guy's giving, despite it being pretty ridiculous, but we're going to get into this. So apparently it's conservative because the popular series exposes Democrats for what they really are: corrupt, frauds, and atheists, and conservative Christians are shown in a positive light. I really don't think that's true. And then it just goes on to talk about Kevin Spacey being accused by Anthony Rapp. So let's talk about this a bit. So generally, House of Cards is about the chief whip of the Democrats in Congress, and that is Kevin Spacey's character, Frank Underwood. This is essentially a remake of the British House of Cards, which was about the Tory party in the 1990s. Very, very good show as well. A bit dated, but thematically very similar, and I enjoyed it a lot. And basically, he's just shown to be like a very, very Machiavellian character. Not very many morals about him, scheming, does pretty illegal things as well, in a very entertaining way. It feels like at times a Shakespeare play. He talks to the audience a lot. He is kind of like the narrator as well. And I think what's really good about House of Cards is that unlike any other show I've seen, it really just shows how corrupt American politics is and how influenced by money American politics is, like corporations and stuff. Characters like Remy and Raymond Tusk obviously illustrate this a lot. But I think fundamentally the message of House of Cards is about the system and how it enables someone like Frank Underwood to rise to power, and how corrupt the system is, and how brutal you have to be within the system, and you're not really beholden to your constituents. Like, there's a whole character of Peter Russo, played by Corey Stoll, in the first season of the show, so spoilers, and Frank Underwood essentially exploits him and destroys him, but Peter Russo betrays his own constituents and friends because Frank Underwood has him by the balls, and he essentially betrays them all in the pursuit of power. Although the show mainly focuses on the Democrats, I don't think it's a massive commentary about just the Democrats. I think it's about the entire system. But I can understand how a Republican might watch that and be like, I told you the Democrats are like crazy corrupt. But it's also pretty clear Frank Underwood is inspired mainly by LBJ and Richard Nixon, a bit in terms of FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt with his wife. But I think the show is really looking at American politics from a very, very cynical point of view, which is far more compatible with a leftist reading of the show than a conservative reading of the show. And even later on in the show, it shows far more the power of the corporate world, and that's kind of like what season 5 and the disastrous season 6 are about. It's all about how much corporations and powerful individuals in the financial sector and stuff can really influence and pervert politics. So I think that message, although it isn't exclusive to the left wing, is, you know, a bit more of a left wing message. And it's probably not surprising because David Fincher did the first episode, but Beau Willimon is the person who was the showrunner. He did most of the show. You look at his background. When he was an undergraduate, he met Jay Carson. In 1998, he worked as a volunteer and intern for the Senate campaign of Chuck Schumer, which led to jobs with Hillary Clinton's 2000 Senate campaign, Bill Bradley's 2000 presidential campaign, and Howard Dean's 2004 presidential campaign. He wrote the play that inspired The Ides of March, that George Clooney film that feels very in line with the world of House of Cards. And recently he actually wrote episodes 8, 9, and 10 of Andor, which is also a more leftist show as well. This guy might be a liberal, but it's still like a more leftist interpretation of US politics, despite focusing mainly on the Democratic Party and like a Democratic president. So yeah, pretty laughable to think House of Cards is a right-wing show that promotes conservative politics. So House of Cards is a weird one. Here's a better one. Luke Cage. Based on the Marvel Comics character of the same name, Luke Cage meets all the qualifications needed to be a staunch American conservative, which has annoyed many liberals. I don't really understand that. And do conservatives honestly want to claim the Luke Cage Netflix show as one of their own, where the ending of season 2 sees Luke Cage become like the head of like a criminal enterprise? Is that the show promoting conservative values? Like, that is really a bizarre one. Who put that entry in? Like, have you not even seen one episode of Luke Cage? And I like Luke Cage a fair amount. I thought season 2 was actually pretty decent despite getting panned, and I didn't really like season 1. The acting is very good, but it's of course steeped in a lot of Harlem culture and talks about a lot of things to do with racism and the position of black people in American society and, you know, black culture in places like Harlem. It's actually very good. The music is very good in the show. I don't think anyone would read that show and think it's conservative, and I think most conservatives would call the show woke and say you don't really want to be Luke Cage, considering he essentially becomes a bad guy by the end of season 2. Like with House of Cards, we could probably dissect the politics of Luke Cage, the politics of the character Luke Cage going way beyond the show, but it's pretty clear it is really steeped in the politics of 2016, like the early days of Black Lives Matter and stuff like that. And anyone who reads that as a conservative show is just insane, in my opinion. Like I said, who even edited that entry in? Because I cannot see anything in Luke Cage that promotes conservatism at all. The cops are shown largely as bad guys, and woke things are shown as good, and it has a lot of diversity. Don't conservatives hate diversity? So I picked this one because it's a war thing with a bit more nuance, and I knew conservatives would like it because it's World War II, but The Pacific, 2010, a World War II military drama that's similar to Saving Private Ryan, promoted the military and American values in a positive light, as well as the Imperial Japanese forces in a negative light. So depicting the Japanese in a negative light, it seems like a pretty easy thing to do for anyone. But I will say with The Pacific, compared to something like Band of Brothers, I think it has a lot more nuance than a lot of war things. And also in terms of depicting the US military in a positive light, I don't think this is a show that necessarily does this, because it really deals with the realities of war. Like, so many US soldiers just do absolutely despicable things in this show, but you understand it in the context of fighting this brutal enemy in the Japanese. Like Rami Malek's character in it, great performance by the way, obviously got him the role of Mr. Robot. The stuff he often does, you're like, you're messed up. Like taking teeth out of dying Japanese soldiers, throwing rocks into like the blood-filled heads of dead Japanese soldiers. There is a lot of stuff in this where you're like, this is really gross. And the character of Eugene Sledge, the whole kind of point of his arc is to show the dehumanization of war, in that he starts to become more like Rami Malek's character throughout the show, even though he kind of doesn't want to be, just because he's so influenced by this US military culture. And I think what's so good about the Pacific is it kind of like can help you recharacterize World War II in your head, because we always see it as a more binary thing, like good versus evil, which can be true in some extent, but with the war against the Japanese in the Pacific specifically, that type of thing had been brewing for a lot longer with the Americans, and of course Pearl Harbor had nothing to do with World War II. It had everything to do with Japanese-American relations. In that kind of like colonial dispute between these two empires, that's what makes the show so much more interesting, maybe than the more binary good versus evil stuff you get in Band of Brothers. Of course, you see the Japanese do absolutely horrific things, but you also see human moments of war in how they both treat the Japanese horribly or sometimes don't treat them as badly. Out of all the like war things I've seen, things that promote the US military and stuff like that, and especially during World War II, I would say the Pacific is one of the more nuanced ones and one of the better ones. Also, wouldn't these guys consider it woke because it has a whole subplot about like women in the US military as well? And the US soldiers are also like really, really racist as well. So not really showing the military in the most heroic of lights, I must admit. But now let's get into even more fun ones. So this one is on the debatable whether it's conservative. So they say there is some conservative messaging in these shows, but it's not totally conservative. So let's get into some of these because they're quite funny as well. So Breaking Bad, which is interesting. So Walter White, previously a law-abiding chemistry teacher, gets involved in drug dealing and destroys himself and his family. That doesn't seem very conservative. Though he appears to be the hero of the series, each immoral decision leads him further along the path of destruction, and the evildoers all suffer for their actions. The justifications for these shows being debatably conservative are like pretty insane. Like, I haven't watched Breaking Bad properly, but of course I know the premise of like a fairly, middle class guy, average guy, seems like a pretty good guy, and he basically goes down this really dark path, which is started by him having cancer and the treatment being really, really expensive, because there's always those memes about Breaking Bad would have ended really quickly if it was set in like the UK or a country with universal healthcare, because he would have got his cancer treated for free and it wouldn't put him in like loads of financial difficulties. I wouldn't say that's probably the most pro-conservative show, because something conservatives love, capitalism and privatized healthcare, well, it doesn't seem to be working so well in preventing crimes in this show. So another one they put on debatable if conservative is The US Office. So mockery of liberal ideology and political correctness in an office setting? What? The main character, Michael, repeatedly encounters contradictions and absurdities as he tries to conform to liberal expectations. The show was most popular when its humour was conservative, and has declined in quality and popularity as its conservative humour has been diluted. Its later seasons were notably more liberal and offensive towards religion. So that little paragraph actually says quite a lot about the person who watched this show, thinking it did promote conservative values and it had a conservative sense of humour before it got more liberal, I guess, after Steve Carell left. But that means you interpret the show as Michael Scott being a good guy, right? And that's what's so hilarious about this reading. Like, they think Michael Scott being politically incorrect and pretty offensive to like his whole office is actually a good thing and is actually making fun of liberal ideology. That really isn't what the show is doing. Just like Ricky Gervais's character was inspired by like a terrible boss Ricky Gervais had, Michael Scott is of course an interpretation of David Brent. And the only difference is, I think, David Brent is meant to be a bad person. Michael Scott is meant to be very, very ignorant, which makes him a bad boss. But I don't think he's evil or malicious, but that does end up with him being grossly offensive. Like, remember when he just like kisses Oscar in front of like the whole office? I'm pretty sure he also outs Oscar as being gay, makes really offensive jokes about Asian people, black people, about Muslim people. Michael Scott is not meant to be the moral heart of the show or the moral center. That's more someone like Pam, for example. Yeah, some of the politically incorrect jokes can be funny as like outrageous and like, I can't believe this guy is even saying stuff like this. Michael Scott is not meant to be, oh my God, he's making fun of how sensitive liberals are. And that's what's funny about The Office. What an absolutely bizarre reading of it. Like, if you hear Michael Scott say like really offensive things and don't laugh at the absurdity of a boss saying that or the awkwardness of the boss saying that, because that's a lot of the humor, and actually say, oh my God, he's so right and these liberals can't take his opinion, then of course that says so much about you rather than the show actually debatably promoting conservatism, apparently. So we got two more focusing on suburban families in like the 1990s, and we have The Simpsons and we have The Sopranos apparently promoting conservatism, or debatably promoting conservatism. So let's start with The Simpsons. In The Simpsons, many businessmen are made out to be dumb, Republicans have at times been depicted as evil, and family values aren't necessarily put in the best light. However, it still mocks liberal values as well as political correctness, even showing the Democrats, Joe Quimby, as the corrupt and incompetent politicians they really are. Although that being said, the character Lisa Simpson has occasionally been used as a soundboard for more liberal views of the show, and although Bart Simpson causes a lot of trouble, he is painted out to be a punk rather than a cool dude. This show is also known for not being as bad as Family Guy. So The Simpsons, even like debatably promoting conservatism, is pretty stupid. I would take this guy's argument more seriously if he started talking about how the show depicted Christianity in a good light through Ned Flanders, but Ned Flanders isn't really a conservative man, is he? He's just a very, very religious man. And generally, religion in the show is shown to be a bad thing. The Simpsons takes jabs at like all religions, but it particularly makes fun of American Christianity. You have funny scenes like when Ned Flanders is the head teacher and he says a prayer over like the intercom, and then Principal Chalmers says, you know, God has no place within these walls, just like facts have no place in organized religion. It does have this like more like edgy atheist slant to it. And of course, it also makes fun of like the corporate influence on religion. But generally, it uses its setting and the family structure to be a big satire. And I don't know about you guys, when the last time is you watched The Simpsons properly, because I loved The Simpsons growing up. I loved Simpsons and Futurama. But when the lockdown started, Disney had just bought Fox, and they put basically all the seasons of Simpsons on Disney Plus, and I watched the first 10 seasons of The Simpsons, and it was really interesting going back to it because one, it still holds up. It's really, really funny. Two, it's interesting what characters I liked and didn't like upon rewatching the first 10 seasons. Like, I hated Homer watching it again, but I loved Homer growing up. I thought it was so funny. But when you get older, you just sympathize more with like Marge and Lisa, and you just think about what a terrible person Homer Simpson is, and all the shit Marge has to put up with, and all the things that Lisa says. And like, well, I agree with Lisa. I used to find her really annoying, and now I agree with pretty much loads of the things she says. And they're shown to be like a pretty standard American family generally, but it's pretty clear like the moral heart of the show is more liberal because it takes aim at like the political class in general. It takes aim at like capitalism and corporatism in general. And these people feel like because this show is happy to criticize liberals, the Democrats in the past, and criticize like how useless the Democrats are, they might say, well, it's a pro-conservative show. But from a more leftist point of view, we will definitely criticize liberals and conservatives. But then you have good scenes like this. So this is Lisa talking to Marge when she becomes a cop, and Lisa says, aren't the police a protective force that maintains the status quo for the wealthy elite? Don't you think we ought to attack the roots of social problems instead of jamming people into overcrowded prisons? And then Marge responding with this like puppet dog to distract her. There is a lot of humor about how useless cops are and how useless the system is. Or sometimes they do satirize like more liberal people like Lisa. But in a scene like this, what she's saying is true, and that's part of the joke. She's saying something that's true, and Marge is just ignoring what she brings up because it's commentating on how people do ignore the actual problems in favor of just massively expanding the police force. So of course, like Mr. Burns is like cartoonishly evil, as like the main like CEO villain in The Simpsons. And of course, you have lots of things to do with environmentalism. You have that whole episode which is a parody of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington with Lisa exposing how corrupt the system is. You have stuff like with Sideshow Bob becoming the mayor, talking about ruling people as like a Republican king, and even Krusty the Clown votes for Sideshow Bob because he promises to lower taxes on the rich. You just generally have a lot of political and social commentary which comes from at least a liberal point of view and at times a leftist point of view. And if you watch The Simpsons, especially the early Simpsons, it feels like the writers have a bit of a vendetta against Republicans more. They criticize Simpsons more. You have a whole episode of Homer fighting Bush Sr., but then of course Bill Clinton is depicted in a very, very negative light in The Simpsons generally. And although I've heard lately that the politics of Simpsons aren't as good as they used to be, they did have an episode where I think Robert Reich was either in it or wrote it, where Hugh Jackman was singing a song about how trickle-down economics has failed and the middle class has essentially disappeared. It does seem to be that Simpsons has always been like a liberal show, and if conservatives want to read into things that aren't there, like apparently it's a conservative show for promoting family or attacking the Democrats, which it does in some ways, then that's just on them because they ignore all the criticism they have of conservatism and religion. So The Simpsons is of course a family show which is more overtly political, which is weird to say, than The Sopranos. Although the TV series glamorizes to some extent the mafia and its exploits, it's also pro-family values, ultimately due to the main protagonist, Tony Soprano, trying to do what is best for his family. And in one episode, Christopher has a condemnation of Howard Zinn's A People's History of the US, in particular the book and the public school system demonization of Christopher Columbus. So David Chase has come out and said that like Tony Soprano would hate Donald Trump. But while researching this, I was trying to find out like what are the politics of the creator, David Chase. I couldn't really find anything good. But the problem with reading Sopranos as conservative is that you'd have to actually think everyone in the show is a good person. Same way they read The Office as Michael Scott being the good person. If you read The Sopranos as a Soprano family being the good guys, then you're just reading the show all wrong. I don't think it glamorizes the Italian mafia beyond like the aesthetics and the funny things about it and like the friendship within it. And because Sopranos is making a resurgence, I'm not going to spoil it, but Tony does a lot of awful things, and Tony does a lot of awful things towards his own family as well. So I'm not going to tell you what they are, but to think this show promotes family values at all is pretty ridiculous. Their whole family life is really, really unhealthy, and that is what is so fascinating. And the show obviously has, you know, interesting commentary about toxic masculinity and just masculinity in general. You know, I like that subplot about Uncle June being the only one to go down on a woman, and he's roasted by everyone else for doing that because they see it as like effeminate because they're so inconsiderate of their own wives in the show. Although I don't know about the politics of David Chase so much, someone who I do know about the work of a bit more is Terence Winter. So Terence Winter wrote about like a quarter of the show and he produced most episodes. He's also famous for being the creator and main writer of Boardwalk Empire, and he also wrote the screenplay for The Wolf of Wall Street. So I'm not saying you can't interpret anything in those shows as pro-conservative, but I will say a lot of Terence Winter's work is not really dealing with moral characters. Like Nucky Thompson in Boardwalk Empire, he does some good things, but he's also fundamentally an absolutely terrible person who ruins the lives of basically everyone he comes into contact with. And you have like Jordan Belfort on that whole film, although I have my problems with The Wolf of Wall Street. Jordan Belfort and 1980s and 1990s capitalism is not shown in a good light in The Wolf of Wall Street, but because it's so funny and outrageous, you can understand why people enjoy it. And I feel like Martin Scorsese and Terence Winter kind of failed with the message of the film because I feel like they do glamorize it far too much compared to what they're actually trying to say. But it feels like a guy who's capable of like writing all these things and writing about a lot of the things in Boardwalk Empire is probably not a guy who's writing these shows to promote conservative messaging, because a lot of conservative elements in these shows are shown as the villain, particularly in things like Boardwalk Empire. Like to think The Sopranos, Boardwalk Empire, and like The Wolf of Wall Street, all made by Terence Winter, promote conservatism, you'd have to interpret the main characters of each show to be like the moral center and to be the good guys in the show and be sort of like the voice of the creator and the writers, which if you interpret any of those as conservative, I just think you're reading them wrong. I'm not saying The Sopranos was set out to push like a left-wing message. I just don't think you can read it as conservative because a lot of conservative values really lead to a lot of problems in the show, and a lot of the things the characters do because of their more like conservative values are seen as bad things, not good things. So that is it, the conclusion to the trilogy. We've now covered the Conservapedia list for video games, movies, and TV shows. So what I want to know is, in this whole list, what is the dumbest one you've seen out of all of them? I have to say Metal Gear Solid Rising, being on the gaming one, with a pretty thorough explanation of why it's conservative, that probably has to be the worst one. Although I will say Fight Club and Judge Dredd in the movie one were nearly as bad. I'd say for this TV one, I guess in terms of not getting the point, The Office would have to be the best example. But the belief that House of Cards somehow promotes conservatism is also pretty laughable. Anyway, that is it for the trilogy. That is it for the video. Thanks again, Blinkist, for sponsoring this video. Start your 7-day free trial by clicking on the link in my pinned comment, and also it's in the description too. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.